of Philippians, if you just follow over there for a moment, on the subject of stewardship tonight, Philippians chapter 4, and then we're going to look at a handful of passages through the book of Genesis. Stewardship, in many cases, we think it is just finances, but the thing we try over and over and over each year to remind us, stewardship is your time, your talents, and your treasures. I was on the phone today with someone from Africa, and Brett, he wants you and me to go to a conference this fall. He wants me to come. I want you to come. And I have to decide what is being a good steward of my time. And what is God's purpose for me. Every time I get an invitation to go somewhere and preach, I have to figure out what is my spot in this world. What does God want me to do? And like when we were in the Philippines, Brother Lorena, he's got a great church there in Manila, and so we were in the second week of January, and he said, would you consider preaching my Baptist Heritage Conference? I said, I would love to do that. I said, when is it? He said, in 3 weeks. I said, I just don't really think that's in the will of God right now. And I said, maybe next year, but I'm not coming back here in 3 weeks. As much as I would like to, there are other things to do, like sleep and eat in and out, and important things like that. But stewardship is everything you have. In the book of James, it says, every good gift and every perfect gift is from above, from the Father of lights, with whom is no variableness, neither shadow of turning. God, every good thing that came into my life came from God, and I have to figure out, what does God want me to do with that? Some of you, you're young, you're in your late teens, your 20s. You've got 30, 40, 50, 60 years to figure out what to do with. You need to be very careful to use those years wisely. What does God want me to do? And you should, you need a job, you got to pay the bills, there's a lot of things like that, but think about, where am I supposed to be and what am I supposed to do? And you don't want to be 50 trying to figure that out. Unless you just got saved at 50, then that's fine. But you don't want to spend 30 years bouncing around like a ping pong ball in a windstorm and try and figure out where you end up. Where you'll end up is in the gutter, and you don't want to do that. But tonight, in regard to stewardship, I want to talk about stewarding the difficult days and just how to mentally face some difficulties. Philippians chapter 4, if you'd look there with me in the book of Philippians, and chapter 4, and just one verse. It's familiar. Many of you probably could quote it. But if you look down at verse 12, actually verse 11 and verse 12, Paul writing from a jail cell now. So picture a first century jail, and he writes in verse 11, not that I speak in respect of want. I'm not sitting here wanting things. He obviously had the right phone and the right tablet and the right tennis shoes, and all those important things. For I have learned in whatsoever state I am, therewith to be content. In verse 12, here's our text. I know both how to be abased, and I know how to abound. Everywhere and in all things I am instructed both to be full and to be hungry, both to abound and to suffer need. I can do all things through Christ, which strengtheneth me. Now, most of us know verse 13, I can do all things through Christ, but we don't like to put it in context. I can do all things in Christ means you know how to suffer through Christ. I can do all things through Christ means you know how to do without, with God's help. Knowing how to do all things, he says in verse 12, I know how to be abased. I can be humiliated. I can be embarrassed. I can face injustice through Christ. And so, using those verses as our text tonight, I just want to go through some very simple things about knowing how to face life. It's not always going to be good. We were talking at the ball game last night. I don't know where I was. Yeah, I was at the game last night, and talking to a few of our men there, and one of them was talking about how they, with the real estate market, how much equity he's gotten in his home. And the other one said he'd been in his home a little longer. And the stock market, or the real estate market, goes up and down. It always has. And up and down, up and down. And we're on maybe an increase right now, going up. And he bought the last time it was up. He said, I paid so much for my house, I've gained all this equity and my house still isn't worth what I owe. And that happens. I remember one of our finest families, this is back in 1990s, a young Christian. They got saved. We were knocking on doors and they got saved. They became very faithful Sunday school teachers, since moved because of work. But I never forget him coming to my office. He says, how do I handle this real estate situation, Pastor? He said, I bought the house, and he said, the market is crumbled. And he said, the houses on my street, like mine, are selling for $100,000 to $150,000 less than I owe. He said, I could give it back to the bank and buy it back and make $100,000. He said, what do you do as a Christian? I said, well, what'd you tell the bank you were going to do? He said, well, I agreed to pay thus and such. And again, those figures are very rough. We're talking about years ago, but that's the ballpark situation. I said, all right, have you lost your job? No. I said, can you still make your house payment? He said, sure. I said, it kind of seems to me like you ought to keep your word. He said, that's what I was afraid you were going to say. And you know what? The stock market came back, or the real estate market came back, and he sold his house for, he had good equity in it by the time he sold his home, and made a lot of money. And where they moved out of California, they were able to buy a much nicer place worth a lot more. Understand this, we're not going to die. But if you don't know how to be abased, you're not going to know how to abound, because you're going to mess up the abounding, because knowing how to hit the lows will help you know how to hit the highs. If you're not careful, by the way, anybody in real estate could tell you that if you spent many years in real estate, you've been broke and you've been rich. Or you've been broke and you've been broke. But nobody's been rich and been rich. I just don't know if that happens. It might have happened, but none of my friends have ever been on the upside twice. But look over to Genesis with me, chapter 12. And this is a simple, very obvious lesson. But while things, we have the employment market, you know, there's help wanted signs everywhere. You notice that? And it might be fast food places, but that's better than picking up aluminum cans. Now, maybe not. Aluminum's worth a lot, but the economy right now is doing well, and most people are working. And I know there's a few exceptions, but most people in the working age, 20 to 55, have got jobs, and some of them wish they had not as much work on their job. They'd like to have more pay and less work, but that's been the dream of crazy people forever. But we are in good days for the most part, and of course there's always difficulties. But look there, if you would, at Genesis 12, and this is the story of Abraham in verse 1. The Lord said to Abram, get thee out of thy country and from thy kindred and from thy father's house unto a land that I will show thee, and I'll make of thee a great nation. I will bless thee, and I'll make thy name great, and thou shalt be a blessing. And I will bless them that blesseth thee, and curse him that curseth thee, and in thee shall all families of the earth be blessed. Now, in those three verses, we see God's call and God's promise of his presence and God's promise of his blessing and protection. Abraham was about to enter into the will of God. Abraham was where he should be, doing what he should do. And I'm not saying he hit it right every time. He went down to Egypt, got Hagar. There were a few blips in the road like we all face. But the bottom line is, Abraham going to Canaan was in the will of God. God called him to do what he was doing. And so there he is in Canaan. Look over at verse 10. And there was a famine in the land. And Abraham went down into Egypt to sojourn there, for the famine was grievous in the land. Now, we're not going to talk about Egypt. We've talked about it before. And probably Abraham should not have gone to Egypt. But the point is that first line in verse 10, there was a famine in the land. And Abram went down to Egypt, for the famine was grievous. There was a grievous famine. And here he was right where God wanted him, but things were a mess. There was no food. There was no provision. And you've got to decide what to do when there's a famine in the land. Now, sometimes God does move you. And anybody who leaves Wildomar, of course, is out of the will of God. And I don't believe that at all. But obviously, there are times jobs move you, college moves you, marriage and family and whatever moves you. But be careful that you don't move just for money. Now we need to work. But I'll tell you this, there's a lot of great people who have money trouble. And I don't know anybody who's been real successful who has not been real broke. I remember the story when President Trump was running for office. Someone that knew him personally said they were walking down a street together, and there was a guy sitting there begging, penniless beggar on the side of the road. And President Trump looked over and said to his friend, "That guy is worth more right now than I am." Because everything had so crumbled that he owed more money than he had. He was deficit in millions of dollars at that point. Good people, successful people hit lows. It's just a reality. I know a guy when we started our church, some of you that are old timers here, Frank Pasquale, he owned 75 acres behind the USA gas station. He owned where the USA gas station is, and all the way out into those fields. It's where we lived for 5 years, where our church rented a building from him. And he told the story. He owned the Southgate Arena, and it was a boxing arena and a wrestling arena. He was a boxing and wrestling promoter, and he was hilarious. You just see the pictures of people, midget wrestlers and boxers and all that funny stuff. Then he turned it into a bowling alley. But anyway, there in Southgate, he owned a big chunk of land, a lot of money. Came out here, and he had land, and he was the mayor of Elsinore. I mean, when you're the mayor of Elsinore, you've hit the top of the success ladder. And what was really funny is he took the bull by the horns. The lake was empty. It was just grown over with brush. It's not a very deep lake. And it had been empty for some years. And he said, "We're going to find a way." And he got a hold of Jerry Brown. Yes, the same Jerry Brown was governor then that he was now. 50 years ago, Jerry Brown was governor. But anyway, he got a hold of whoever. And he negotiated, spent money, and he got water in to fill Lake Elsinore. That winter, it rained so much, it flooded the whole valley. If they'd have just left it alone, it would have filled Elsinore all on its own and not flooded everybody. But anyhow, those things happen in life. And he moved out and got 75 acres there off 15 and Clinton Keith Road and lived there till he died. Now, talking with him, he was so tight. I remember one Thanksgiving morning, or the day before Thanksgiving, maybe Josh was a baby just born, but we were living next door. They had a second 2-bedroom house next door we rented, and we didn't have enough tinfoil to cover the turkey. And I went next door to he and Miss Pasquale, and I said, "We don't have enough foil to cover our turkey. Do you have just a chunk of foil I could borrow?" And he said, "Oh yeah, we got a lot of foil." Come in this huge walk-in pantry. And I promise you, he had every piece of foil they had ever used. Still with the residue from whatever it had covered. This was ham foil, this was turkey foil, this was bacon, I have no idea. And he just pulled up, "This look big enough?" And I'm thinking, "Yeah, it's big enough, but I don't even want to touch that. It's disgusting." And hey, I said, "Yes, thank you." Who saves their tin foil? Don't raise your hand. He said, "I have been so broke, I can't throw away a piece of tin foil." He'd been rich, and he lost everything. And he'd been rich and lost everything. He drove the worst old beat-up van. It was just a piece of junk. But he wasn't spending any money because he was not going to be broke again. Now, and I'm not using, and wasn't a Christian. He did get saved while we were there. But the fact is, Abraham was as in the will of God as you could be, or I could be, but a grievous famine came. The issue is not, do bad things come? The issue is, can you steward those things? That's the issue. Can you go through those times in a manner honoring to God? Look over to chapter 26, just a couple of pages over, Genesis 26, and we'll see a similar story just a few years down the road. Genesis chapter 26. In verse 1, "And there was a famine in the land, besides the first famine that was in the days of Abraham. And Isaac," so Abraham's son is Isaac. Abraham's gone now. Isaac's an adult. And you know what? Isn't it interesting? There was a famine in Dad's generation, and there's a famine in the son's generation. Can I tell you, there's going to be bad days. It's going to happen. And so he says there was a famine in the land in the days of, not beside the first famine that was in the days of Abram. And Isaac went to Abimelech, the king of the Philistines, into Gerar, and on and on. The Lord appeared to him in verse 2 and said, go not down to Egypt. Your daddy tried that. It didn't go well. Dwell in the land which I shall tell thee of. And he goes on. But the fact is, in Genesis 26, there's another famine in the land. Same scenario, a good man in the will of God, where he should be, and things go wrong. And I was thinking of the man, and I probably shouldn't say who it is, some of you might know him, but a man who was faithful to our church and did a lot of work here. Good man, good young man, his mid-30s, skilled labor. And could never quite win his wife. She may have got saved, may not, I don't know. But this is a great guy. But he worked with his hands, and he loved construction work. But obviously with construction, you get some of those ripples in the world, and it happens some. And he came to me one day, he said, Pastor, my wife is ready to leave me. I said, what for? He said, she wants to marry a guy who comes home at the end of the day with clean hands. And I said, well, she's already married a guy. And in the long story short, she had gotten a job as an assistant at a pharmacy somewhere, and she ended up leaving her husband. And this was a great guy, and loved his work and loved his family. But things didn't go like she wanted, and she walked out. I can tell you this, I promise you this, things still didn't go like she wanted. And after that, things didn't go like she wanted again. Because I can tell you, every couple of decades, things don't go like we want them. We've been here 35 years. This last August, our 35th church anniversary. In these 35 years, some of you have been here through much of it. There have been a few low spots. Around our 10th anniversary, the bottom came out of everything. And all I focused on was, I have to do right. I had just hired Brother Beal to run our Christian school. He'd left a great job to come work for us. And then suddenly, we don't have any property. We don't have any buildings. We don't have any money. And we were in a mess. And I told him, I said, you can run the school out of your trunk of your car, door to door. You can rent a building. You can close the school. I don't care what you do. I've got one focus. I have to keep this church alive. That's what God called me to do. I had to draw in everything and realign myself. What is it that I am here to do? What I was here to do, number one, was to walk with God. Number two, to care for my family. And number three, to pastor this church. But I had all the extras. I had to trim them all off because I had to survive. I had the flu for 3 months. I was just sick. And Brother Williams one day said, my favorite days in the church was when we had nowhere to meet. And I said, I hate you. Those are the... I was sick in my stomach for months during those days. But you know what happened? We got this property, we put the tent up out there, and things went on. We had big days, people got saved, things are growing, people are doing well, bills are paid. Building, we moved into this building, and I stood right under that overhang with the inspector, the county inspector. I said, now look, but we had not yet taken title to the let I said, now just be honest with me. I'm about to take title to this property for our church. I said, if I do it, what will it take to get into that building? He said, yeah, maybe a month or two, just a couple of pieces of paper, no big deal. I made the mistake of believing a bureaucrat. A year later and $100,000 later, we were in the office. And I can't even tell you, Brother Grisson and others could tell you, tens of thousands of dollars, hundreds of thousands of dollars, and years later, we got this section and then the next section. But you know what? Just because somebody did something not quite right, the famines come. Things don't go right. And so again, you've got to kind of draw your world in a little bit and say, all right, how am I supposed to handle this famine in my land? It may not be economic. It might be your health. It might be something in your family goes on. How am I supposed to act when the famine comes? Another in that same era, we had several famine-ish things going on. There were outdoor storage tanks, underground diesel tanks, one by the friendship room door, conference room door, and then one in the back of the building right by the Spanish church entrance. They had generators, backup generators, and they had underground storage tanks. And I told the people, we were negotiating, and I said, that all needs to be out and taken care of before we take title of the property, because I don't want to deal with contaminated soil. That's a huge problem, and I want no part of it. And they said, we'll take care of it, no problem. Well, I'm at camp, winter camp up in Idlewild. It's coming on New Year's Day, New Year's Eve, somewhere right at the end of the year. And somehow they got a hold of me, and they said, we're ready to sign papers, and we'd love to get it settled before New Year's Day to, finish the year, blah, blah, blah. And remember what I said before church started? When somebody's in a hurry, back off. I'm at camp, and we're ready to trade 2.5 acres on Clinton Keith for 16 acres in buildings on Walnut Street. That's a good trade. Unless there's contaminated soil. And they said, we will come up, we'll bring a notary, you won't have to stop right on your camp. The secretary explained what you're doing, blah, blah, blah. They drove up there, middle of the night. Sat down, signed all right, got everything, fuel tanks, everything done. Yeah, all taken care of. I didn't bother to ask for any documentation because they certify that. State certified pieces of paper, but when you're young, you don't know that. And I'm still young. If you see something dumb that I do, it's because I'm young compared to an elephant or something. I don't know, but tortoise. I signed all the papers. We come home. What they did is they took the tanks out. They didn't take one shred of dirt out. Those tanks have been underground for 30 years. And at the time, we had a geologist going to our church, and he said, Pastor, 30 years underground tanks, we're going to dig the whole 16 acres up. Because you have to not only dig it all up, you've got to dispose of that contaminated soil. It's a huge, huge thing. And I said, well, you just see what you can do. We're going to commit it to God. But at some point, you have to step back and say, I did my best. I'm going to trust God. I'm going to read my Bible. I'm going to pray. I'm going to be honorable in my behavior. I'm not going to shoot anybody. I'll let God kill them. And I remember, I don't know how many tanks, 55-gallon drums out there all over the parking lot, dozens of them from all the samples he took everywhere. Finally comes into my office, because that was his job. His job was soil certification. And he said, just want you to know, God does miracles. He said, there's not one shred of contaminated soil in this whole place. Now, either he lied and cheated, or there was no soil contaminated, and I didn't really care which one. All I cared about was that piece of paper that said we're good. If he lied, it's between him and God. I did, no, don't tell me. I just want my piece of paper. But your famine's going to come. Look on a little bit further. Look over to chapter 41. And you know this story. Chapter 41. And we're looking at men that were the best of the best. Abraham and his son Isaac. We'll go 2 generations down to Joseph, and you're familiar with this. Genesis chapter 41. Remember, the Pharaoh had a dream, and Joseph interprets the dream. So this is Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph. So now, we're the 4th generation now. Look down at verse 27, verse 25, as we look at the interpretation of the dream. And Joseph said to Pharaoh, the dream of Pharaoh is one. God has showed Pharaoh what he's about to do. So God is about to do something. Verse 26, the 7 good kine or cattle are 7 years, and the 7 good ears of corn are 7 years. The dream is one. And the 7 thin and ill-favored kine that come up after them are 7 years. The 7 empty ears blasted with the east wind shall be 7 years of famine. Now we've got 7 years of famine. Joseph is as good a man as there was. Abraham was called the friend of God. So we got Abraham had a famine, Isaac had a famine, Jacob had 4 wives. And Joseph had a famine in his day. And you know what happened? They made it through it. They made it through it. And again, in Joseph's day, there's a formula: save 20% during the days of prosperity so that you can get through the days when everything's falling apart. But the fact is, we're looking at people who face famines. One more, look at Ruth. If you could find the book of Ruth and right after the book of Judges. Joshua, Judges, and Ruth before Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles. Ruth chapter 1. That's a hard book to find there, just a little one in the middle. Ruth chapter 1. Now, the point of this, and we'll do a little more of this, stewardship is being wise enough to know how to handle the days that you didn't want to face. Because you are going to face, like I look at Natasha here. She's got the twins. That was her famine. But I was with her with the twins little and Brendan in the hospital having surgery. You don't pick those days. Those days come. And the key in every famine that we enter into is knowing, how do I handle this thing? Not how do I get out of it, not how I get around it, because you know what? You're not going to get around them. A lot of these burdens, maybe God's going to do some wonderful miracle, but most of the time we get through what we cannot get over. We go through what we can't get around. I was talking to one of our members that had a business problem, and his business partner had done him wrong in an incredible way. And he said, you know what I decided, Pastor? I decided I'll let him face God, and I'll let me face God. I'm going to go on and have a good life. And it's been 20 years now, and he's doing great. Everything's well, and he's got a clean conscience, and he handled it. Look, the fact that your difficulty comes, and by the way, your difficulty may come because you've messed things up, but isn't it great that God shows you how to walk out of difficulty? You confess it, you forsake it, you control your actions, and you go on for God. So we're there in Ruth chapter 1, and this is reminiscent of Genesis with Abraham. Ruth chapter 1 verse 1, now it came to pass in the days when the judges ruled that there was a famine in the land, and a certain man of Bethlehem, Judah, went to sojourn in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. Now, you know that story, I would assume. So there's a gal named Ruth and her husband, and they had 2 boys, and there was a famine in the land. And they were in Bethlehem, that area around Jerusalem, and things were good, but then the famine comes. So they leave Bethlehem and Jerusalem area, and they go on over to Moab, to the heathen. They get, if we want to use our terms, they got out of church, they got out of fellowship, they got away from the people of God, and their boys married 2 heathen girls. And the husband dies. I'll just throw this out as my opinion. I can't tell you the will of God for you. But if God moves you, he will move you where there's a good church. That's just my opinion. Brother and Mr. Rubio here moved to Seattle and then to New Mexico. I don't know if there's any in between. But in Seattle, they were a huge help to Kirby Campbell's church. And I don't know if you all know that Kirby Campbell is basically well, and he's pastoring now in Florida. Just a miracle the last year has taken place in his life. But I know some of you know the story. And then they were in New Mexico, in a good church, serving there. And look, if God moves you, there'll be a place of fellowship. There'll be a good church. If there's no church, then he wants you to start a church. If there's no church and you don't want to start a church, then it's not the will of God. That's just my opinion. He may want you to move somewhere where there's no Christians, and I don't know what he wants you to do. That's between you and God. But my perspective of watching 40 years of Christians, God knows where you are. God knows what you need. And God knows your children's needs. God knows your needs. And all of us need a church and preaching and fellowship. And we need a church. And what Elimelech did and Naomi is they moved where there was no Christianity, in using their vernacular. There were no Jews over there. They moved into a heathen world. And it was just a tragic end. And then they come back. They found out after the mess, the boys both die and the husband dies. Ruth, the daughter-in-law, and Naomi, they come back. And you know what's funny? They come back, and the story, and again, I'm not picking on anybody, but they're in the area around Jerusalem, and there's no work, there's no food. So they all go over to Moab. And then after years, long enough for the kids to, we don't know what age they were, but long enough for them to get married or to finish growing up and get married, and then long enough for them to die and the husband to die, so at least a few years they're there. Could have been many, many years. And they hear that there's food or there's work back in Jerusalem area. And so they go back. And you know what's funny? Is there were people there who knew her. They say, hey, look, there's Naomi. I wonder how they ate. I wonder where they worked. Or did they all leave because there was no food and they all came back at the same time? I don't know. I'm kind of thinking there's a way to stay in the will of God. And that's the point. Be in the will of God. If the whole world's come unglued, be in the will of God. Be in the will of God. Stewardship is saying, I'm going to be in the will of God as I go through this trial. I'm going to do it. I'm just going to do one more. Look at Job. We got time. I'll show you one more. And again, these are familiar stories, but I want you to see and think through this. You're not bad when things go wrong. Something goes wrong with your child. It's sad to me to see a marriage split up and both people get out of church. Or a young person messes up and the parents don't want to come back to church because their child messed up. Can I tell you, this church is full of people who are hurting. There's people in this room all the time that we met in jail. You know, Sunday guy caught me outside. We're talking a little bit, and he said, hey, have you seen Pat McDowell? He didn't know his last name, but it was Pat McDowell. And I said, well, let me look around. I'll find him. He said, well, he met me a few months ago in jail, and I told him when I got out I was going to be here. And I'm here, and I want him to know I'm here. And then we saw him. You know what? That guy can be right in the will of God. No reason. You know, he can't confess and forsake and get into church and get, I'm assuming he's saved already, needs to get baptized, get grown in grace. Hey, our church is full of sinners in case you haven't noticed. Hold your purse. A lot of sinners in this room. But look at Job chapter 1 and realize we will go through trials, and very, very good people go through trials. We look here in Job chapter 1. And if you look at Job 1 verse 8, Job chapter 1 verse 8, and the Lord said unto Satan, hast thou considered my servant Job, that there is none like him in the earth, a perfect and an upright man, one that feareth God and sheweth evil. God's opinion of Job is that he was perfect and upright. And yet, the greatest devastation entered into this man's life. And sometimes, maybe our spouse or our child or our boss or our whatever, something may come into our world through them. God didn't abandon you in that. And I think the first thing that most of us do when trouble comes is we say, what did I do? And maybe you did, but the fact is, life's difficult. There are burdens. There are trials. And these things come by, and the hurricanes and the tornadoes and the financial reversals and the stock market crashes. And could I say this, ladies? You didn't marry Superman and the man of all wisdom and knowledge. You thought you did. But within 10 years, you'll know you didn't. He'll make dumb choices. He'll do something that disappoints you. He'll mishandle money. He's going to mess up. You know, back there, Angelica, he won't ever mess up. He'll be the perfect husband. But just in case he ever does, look, it's a reality. You know, you that are employed at the church, your boss is flesh. He will make bad choices. 35 years here, if I have not at least once or twice let you down, you've not been paying attention. You didn't come often enough. Don't get out of church because the pastor turned out to be a sinner. Now, if the pastor turned out to be an embezzler, an adulterer, or whatever, then maybe you need to fire him and get another pastor. But there's nothing wrong with the church. Don't get out of church. Don't get out of your Bible. Don't get out of your prayer life. So what happens? After this perfect and upright man in verse 8, 10 children die, and he lost everything he had. Look over to verse 21. Job chapter 1, verse 21. And after his children all die, 10 children die, everything he owns is gone. Verse 21, he says, naked came out of my mother's womb, naked shall I return thither. The Lord gave, the Lord hath taken away, blessed be the name of the Lord. And the key is there, verse 22, and all this Job sinned not. When your famine comes, be sure you walk straight and don't sin. I can't control the medical reports. I can't control the employment. I can't control the presidency. But in all this, Job sinned not. You know, my spouse can run off and leave me. What I need to do is just draw in real tight with God and say, God, help me make every step careful, because the famine is here. Help me not be the one that this trouble causes me to go off crazy. Chapter 2, look over at chapter 2, verse 3. You know the story. Some years or months or whatever time later, Job's kids have been gone, his wealth gone, he's sitting on an ash heap. The Lord and the devil talk again in verse 3. And the Lord said to Satan, hast thou considered my servant Job? There's none like him in the earth, a perfect and upright man, one that feareth God and sheweth evil, and still he holdeth fast his integrity. See, the key thing that God admired in Job, he held on to his integrity. He was going to keep doing right, though the world was all wrong. And it's like going to the ocean. When we were children, we'd go to the ocean up along Ventura area a lot. And, you know, mom and dad sitting here on the beach, and your kids playing in the water, and the water moves you. And pretty soon you turn around and look, and mom and dad moved. They're trying to get rid of us or something. So you go back up to mom and dad, and slowly the water moves you back down. And that's what trials will do. Trials will move you, and trials will get you to become bitter and angry or jealous, or they'll get you to say things you shouldn't say. And can I tell you, trials are going to come. And I know people in this church, and I'm certainly not one of them, but I know some people who've had burdens that I look at them and think, I don't know how they do it. I don't know how they carry the load they carry. Things that went wrong that they couldn't have caused if they wanted them to go wrong. Trouble that came their way that it was beyond belief. You think, how could that much trouble come on them? One of our men said to me, he said, Jesus suffered a lot, but his was only in one day. And I said, don't even say that. God could really up the scale here, pal. But there's some burdens people carry. And yet if you look down at verse 10 of chapter 2, but he said to her, his wife, she said, why don't you curse God and die? In verse 10 and 9 and 10, 8 and 9, in verse 10, he spoke to her, thou speakest as one of the foolish women speaketh. What shall we receive good at the hand of the Lord, and shall we not receive evil? And all this did not Job sin with his lips. And again, the point of the whole lesson tonight, when it's talking about stewardship, I've got to steward my tomorrow. And if my world comes to an end tonight, I still got to steward my tomorrow. I've got to live my tomorrow in a way honoring to God. And if something unexpected comes along and I just can't believe this happened, you know what I need to do? I need to get up, I need to read my Bible, I need to pray, take time with God. I need to love those people I'm supposed to love. I need to dislike those people I'm supposed to dislike. I need to go to work, do my job, and I may do it through tears, but I can't let those things move me. I need to retain my integrity. And the ability, see, good stewardship of trials is retaining your faith. It's, why would God do this? You're going to have a moment of that, but don't live there. Some of you, your background has been very difficult, and you think, why did I have to go through all this when none of my friends did? I don't know, but you still have the duty to retain your integrity. I don't know why you have these troubles that are so beyond, you know, I almost feel guilty sometimes. I've never known a day in my life when I wasn't loved. Even when my parents split up, they were both so good and good to us, my brother and I. And my mom remarries and had the greatest guy in the world, raised me through my teen years. And some of you, you didn't have those things, but I'll tell you what, God didn't die in your world. One of the men, April 1st, Brother Alan Domley will be here. And I asked Brother Domley this the other day, we were talking about a situation. I said, I need your perspective. Because Brother Domley is an evangelist, great preacher, very well known across America, and his dad's sitting in jail for life. And he was a pastor up in Central California. And just recently was up for parole, and it was denied. And my Brother Domley said he'll probably be in jail the rest of his life. I said, okay, tell me how the preacher's kid handles it. He said, the preacher's kid keeps believing God's alive. The preacher's kid keeps believing God knows what I need. And he said, Brother Goddard, you have no idea how many dozens and dozens. He said, probably once a month or more, I talk to a child, an adult or teen child, of a parent who's done something incredibly wrong and walk them through the emotion. He said, why did God let me face this? Because of the hundreds I've been able to help. See, in his famine, he retained his integrity, and he was a good steward of his hurt, so that person after person after person after person has been helped. Now, looking back, would he wish he'd never been through it? Absolutely. Would he like to erase those memories or whatever hurt? I don't know any of the details. I love to not. I glory in ignorance. Some of you have noticed that. I just love to don't know what's going on. Some of you think, I don't think the pastor knows what's going on. Hallelujah. It's easier to sleep at night when I don't know what's going on. So those trials that he didn't like, that spiritual or legal or whatever famine in his life, he retained his integrity, and he's taken the last 10, 20 years and lived for God. Was it easy? No. Was it good? No. Is it what any of us would have chosen? No. But the fact is, we don't get a choice where the storm comes. It comes. We do have a choice how we respond in the storm. And that is God's plan for your life. If you sit here tonight, especially young people, some of you have had great parents and great homes, and you just can't, the worst day for you is when there was no jelly. Like I remember as a kid once, a couple of times we were out of toothpaste, and my mom brought baking soda. She said, oh, this is just as good. Wet your toothbrush, put it in baking soda. Yuck! That is repulsive. How many of you brushed your teeth with baking soda and would never do it if you didn't have to? That's a terrible thing. I don't mind not brushing my teeth. There are those days but when that's your bad day, you got a pretty good life. You got a pretty good life. But the storms have come, and you got to say, I'm going to retain my integrity and do right through the famine. All right, let's pray. Father, bless us. Help us, because all of us are going to face those famine days. Great people like Abraham and Isaac, Joseph and Job, just these four, went through extreme burdens. And may we determine to steward our trials, to be faithful. May we just decide, I'm going to keep walking straight when things go wrong. I'll have to walk a little slower maybe a little more deliberately, but I'm going to be careful to not do anything stupid when things have gone wrong. Bless us tonight. Bless your people. A lot of faithful workers here who carry a load, and some who one day will be shocked by what enters their life. I pray for grace for them, that they might steward their storms in a way that would please you. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, God bless you. Thanks for being here. Remember, if you're dropping off anything for our seniors, get it there tonight or first thing in the morning.